Millionaire CEO, shocked after little girl calls to say his son collapsed on the street. The tall glass windows of Hale Enterprises gleamed in the afternoon sun, and inside, Richard Hale sat behind his massive mahogany desk, flipping through contracts and reports, his mind buried in business matters that defined his life. His office was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of air conditioning and the occasional buzz of his phone, which usually brought updates from his assistant or messages about investors waiting for his approval. Today was no different, until the device vibrated with an unknown number flashing on the screen. Richard rarely answered calls like that, but something inside him, a strange unease, urged him to pick it up. He pressed the button and raised it to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice steady, commanding, the tone of a man used to being in control. For a brief moment, silence filled the line, and then came a trembling little voice. "Sir, please, your son." The words froze him instantly. His pen slipped from his hand, rolling across the polished surface of the desk. His heart thudded painfully against his chest. "What about my son?" he demanded, though his voice shook in a way his employees had never heard. "He collapsed, on the street. He isn't moving. Please come quickly." Richard's breath caught in his throat, and the world around him blurred. The ticking clock on the wall suddenly sounded unbearably loud, every second a cruel reminder of his helplessness. "Where is he? Tell me now!" His voice broke into desperation as the girl stammered out a location, her words shaking, almost drowned by the background noise of traffic. Richard's imagination immediately painted terrifying images. His son lying on cold pavement, helpless, maybe in pain, maybe worse. Sweat prickled his forehead as he shoved his chair back so roughly it screeched across the marble floor. His assistants, startled, looked up as he stormed toward the door, but Richard didn't slow, didn't explain. He snatched his keys, phone, and jacket in one motion, leaving the documents on his desk, scattered and forgotten. "Cancel everything," he muttered to his assistant. "But sir, the investors—" "Cancel everything!" he thundered, his voice echoing down the corridor. His polished shoes struck the floor with unsteady urgency, each step carrying him closer to fear he could not control. He slammed the elevator button, his hand trembling as the metal doors reflected back an image of a man he barely recognized. Sweat on his brow, panic in his eyes. The wait felt eternal. When the doors slid open at last, he stepped inside, pressing the button again and again, begging the machine to move faster. The little girl's voice echoed in his mind, trembling yet brave. "Collapsed, not moving. Please come quickly." His chest heaved as guilt clawed at him. He thought of Daniel, his boy, his only child. Memories of small hands clutching his finger, of laughter in their garden, of bedtime stories he had once read. Memories that felt distant now, buried beneath meetings and deadlines. Why wasn't I there? Why was he on the street? The elevator doors finally opened and Richard sprinted across the lobby, ignoring the confused stares of staff. Outside, his black luxury car gleamed in the sun, the chauffeur already holding the door. But Richard waved him off, snatching the keys. "I'll drive." His voice cracked with urgency. Sliding into the driver's seat, he slammed the door and pressed the accelerator hard. The engine roared, tires screeched, and the city became a blur of color and noise. Horns blared as he cut across lanes, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, his heart pounding louder than the engine. Every red light felt unbearable, every car in front of him, an obstacle being between him and his son. He pressed harder, weaving through traffic recklessly, uncaring of curses shouted from windows. His chest tightened further as the little girl's voice echoed again, reminding him of the fragility of the moment. How did she even find my number? He wondered briefly, but fear swallowed the thought. Nothing mattered except reaching Daniel. Street signs passed in a blur as he followed the directions, each turn winding him deeper into a neighborhood far different from the polished world he knew. Cracked sidewalks, faded buildings, and children playing in the dust. It was not a place where he imagined finding his son. And then he saw it. A small crowd gathered at the far end of the street. His pulse quickened as he swerved to the curb, leaping from the car before it fully stopped. The air smelled of dust and smoke, and his polished shoes struck the uneven pavement hard. His expensive suit caught the attention of bystanders, but he didn't notice. His eyes locked on a frail girl waving frantically. Her tangled hair blew in the breeze, her face pale with worry. "Sir, here!" she called, her small voice echoing with urgency. Richard recognized her immediately. It was the voice from the phone. His legs carried him forward with desperate speed, his breath ragged. He reached her, gripping her shoulder. "Where is he? My son! Where is he?" The girl pointed toward the ground, her hand trembling. Richard followed her gaze, and his world shattered. There, lying on the rough pavement, was Daniel. His boy's body was still, his face pale, his arms limp. Dust clung to his clothes, his eyes were closed, and he looked far too fragile. Richard's stomach twisted violently as his vision blurred. The sounds of the street faded away, drowned by the thunder of his own heartbeat. "Daniel," he whispered, the name breaking on his lips. His knees felt weak as he dropped beside his son, hands trembling above the boy's small frame. He reached out, brushing his son's cold hand with his fingertips. Tears stung his eyes as guilt and fear merged into unbearable pain. The powerful CEO, the man feared and respected by many, was reduced to nothing but a desperate father, powerless before the sight of his unconscious child. Richard's hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel. The image of his unconscious son burned into his mind like fire he couldn't escape. And though the car sped down the road with a roar, his thoughts were far ahead, tangled in memories and regrets that came rushing without mercy. He could see Daniel as a boy again, running barefoot across the garden with a laugh so pure it could melt stone, his small arms stretched wide as if the whole world belonged to him. He remembered the boy's habit of sneaking into his office late at night, carrying his favorite toy car, waiting for his father to look up and notice him. And yet, more often than not, Richard had kept his eyes glued to papers and screens, offering only distracted nods and absent promises. The memories twisted like knives now, each one heavier than the last, and as his car raced through the streets, his eyes blurred with tears that he tried to blink away. The thought of Daniel lying helpless filled him with a terror he had never known, a terror that stripped away every title, every ounce of pride, every shield he had built as a man of power. Guilt flooded him, rising higher with every turn of the road. He realized how many times he had brushed his son aside with the excuse of work, how many birthdays he had missed, how many nights Daniel had probably waited by his door, only to fall asleep alone. His chest ached as though a weight pressed against it, and his breath grew uneven. The world outside blurred. Traffic lights, pedestrians, and city noise faded into the background, drowned by the thunder of his thoughts. He slammed his fist lightly against the steering wheel, a choked sound escaping his throat. He wanted to scream, to curse himself, to turn back time and trade every deal, every dollar, every empire he built, just to have been there when Daniel needed him most. The city streets stretched endlessly before him, but his mind was filled with fragments. Daniel's first school recital he had missed, the soccer game he had promised to attend but never did, the drawing his son had once proudly shown him only for Richard to respond with a distracted, "Later, son." Every later had built a wall between them, and now, with his boy's life hanging in uncertainty, that wall crushed him from the inside. His grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched against the sob that threatened to escape. His heart raced faster than the car itself, a painful drumbeat that echoed his desperation. The lights of the city flickered against the windshield, casting shadows across his face, but he barely noticed. All he could see was Daniel's small hand slipping from his. All he could hear was the laughter that once filled their home, but had been silenced by his absence. Tears slipped down his cheeks, hot and unrelenting, and he didn't even bother wiping them away. They blurred his vision, but he kept driving, each mile dragging him deeper into the torment of his own conscience. The car surged forward, but Richard felt trapped, caught between the father he had failed to be and the father he longed to become. He whispered Daniel's name under his breath, over and over, as if the sound alone might tether his son to life. The sound cracked in his throat, raw with anguish. He had never prayed before, not truly, but now he found himself whispering broken pleas to the universe, to God, to anyone who might be listening. Please, don't take him from me. Please let me fix this. His hands tightened again, trembling as he pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to close the distance between them. The weight of his own failings bore down on him, suffocating. And yet it was the thought of his son's eyes opening again, of hearing him yell out "Dad," that kept him moving forward. Fear and guilt consumed him, tearing at the core of who he was, but within that storm was also the faint spark of love, a love that had always been there but hidden under layers of work and ambition. Now, as his car hurtled through the streets, that love blazed fiercely, demanding to be seen, demanding to be felt, and demanding that he fight with everything he had for the boy who was his entire world. Richard's car screeched to a halt as he reached the narrow street the girl had described, his chest heaving as he leapt out, the air sharp against his lungs, and then his eyes fell upon a small figure at the corner. A frail girl no older than 10, cradling Daniel's head carefully in her lap, as though he were her own brother. Her hair was messy, her clothes worn thin, the fabric frayed at the edges, and her sandals barely clung to her feet, but her eyes held a bravery that shone through the fear trembling in her hands. Richard's breath hitched as he rushed toward her, his heart twisting at the sight of his son so still, his chest rising only faintly, his face pale and fragile against the rough street. The girl looked up, her voice trembling but steady enough to speak. "Sir, I found him like this. I didn't know what else to do. So I called you." The words pierced Richard's chest like arrows, not because of their weight, but because of the innocence and courage it had taken for this child to act when so many adults might have walked past. He fell to his knees beside Daniel, his tailored suit scraping against the dusty pavement. But he didn't care. His hand immediately reached for his son's, clutching it tightly as if the warmth might bring him back. His throat closed as he looked at Daniel's small face, lifeless in the girl's lap, and in that moment all the walls Richard had built to protect himself, all the pride and distance he had kept, crumbled into nothing. The girl's eyes watched him silently, wide and uncertain, yet she stayed firm, her lap steady under Daniel's head, her little fingers brushing strands of hair gently away from his forehead, as though she had done this before, as though caring for others came naturally to her. Richard could barely comprehend the strength she carried in her small frame. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling as it brushed against his son's cheek, the coldness of the skin terrifying him more than anything he had ever faced in boardrooms or battles for power. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice raw, breaking with emotion. But Daniel did not stir. The little girl lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her voice soft but filled with honesty. "I didn't want to leave him alone. I was scared, but I thought maybe you'd come if I called." Her words shook him in ways he couldn't describe, and his eyes stung with tears. This stranger, a child who had nothing, had chosen not to walk away. She had chosen to act, and because of her, he was here. He looked at her again, noticing the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the thinness of her frame, but also the fire in her spirit. She wasn't crying, though her lips quivered. She wasn't panicking, though her hands shook. Instead, she had stayed calm enough to comfort his son the only way she knew how, by keeping him from lying alone on the cold street. Richard wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat, trapped beneath the tidal wave of emotions threatening to drown him. Instead, he squeezed Daniel's hand harder, desperate to feel a response, while the girl watched him quietly, her gaze a mixture of fear, innocence, and hope. Around them the world continued, the noise of traffic, the voices of distant passers-by. But for Richard, time had slowed to this small corner of the street, where a girl's courage had given him one more chance to be a father. His mind, sharp and calculating in business, faltered now as he realized the depth of what stood before him. A stranger child who showed more bravery than he had, a fragile son who lay on the edge of consciousness, and himself, a man stripped bare of all the power that once seemed unshakable. He lowered his head, resting his forehead lightly against Daniel's hand, his shoulders trembling with silent sobs, while the girl's steady presence grounded the moment, reminding him that even in fear, even in helplessness, courage could come from the most unexpected hearts. Richard's breath came fast and shallow as he lifted Daniel into his arms, the weight of his son far heavier than it should have been because of the fear pressing down on his chest, and with the girl running alongside, guiding and steadying where she could, they hurried toward his car. The world around him blurred into a haze of horns, voices and footsteps, none of it mattering as he carefully laid Daniel across the back seat, his movements frantic but gentle, every second stretching unbearably long. "Stay with me, son," he whispered, his hands trembling as he adjusted Daniel's head on the seat, brushing strands of hair from his pale forehead before slamming the door shut and sliding behind the wheel. The girl climbed into the passenger seat at his nod, her small hands clenched tightly in her lap, her lips moving silently in prayer as Richard started the engine with a roar and sped into the street. The city lights streaked past them in a blur, and the car seemed to fly, but no speed felt fast enough as Richard's heart thundered in his chest, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror every second to make sure his son's chest was still rising faintly. He whispered broken pleas as he drove, words tumbling out uncontrolled, promises, apologies, prayers, all directed at the still form lying behind him. "Please don't leave me, Daniel, please," he murmured over and over, his voice raw, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. The little girl sat silently beside him, her eyes wide with worry, her body braced against the seat as the car swerved through traffic, but she didn't complain, didn't cry out. Instead, she closed her eyes and pressed her palms together, whispering under her breath, as though she believed her words alone could reach heaven faster than the car could reach the hospital. Richard caught sight of her reflection once, her small frame shaking, yet her courage unwavering, and he felt a strange surge of strength from it, as though this child's faith could carry them through. The hospital loomed ahead, its glowing red sign like a beacon in the night, and Richard swerved sharply into the entrance, tires screeching as he stopped in front of the emergency doors. He was out of the car in seconds, flinging the back door open and scooping Daniel into his arms again, his voice breaking as he shouted for help. Nurses rushed forward, a stretcher rolling quickly, and Richard placed his son down with trembling hands, stumbling as they wheeled him inside, his legs weak beneath him, but his resolve unshaken. He tried to follow, but the medical staff blocked his way, urging him to wait, promising to do everything they could. His heart twisted violently as he was forced to let go, his hands slipping reluctantly from Daniel's as the stretcher disappeared through swinging doors. Richard staggered back, his breath ragged, and collapsed onto a chair in the waiting area, his face buried in his hands. The girl stood near the doorway, silent and small against the sterile white walls, her eyes fixed on the doors that had swallowed Daniel. She pressed her hands together tighter, whispering prayers in a voice too soft to hear, her little shoulders tense with the weight of hope. Richard looked up, his eyes red and wet, watching her from across the room. For reasons he could not explain, her presence, steady, ed him. Though she was just a child, she seemed to carry something unshakable that he himself lacked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands pressed against his face, whispering to himself, "Please don't leave me, son. Please give me one more chance. I'll be the father you need, I swear it." His voice cracked as he remembered all the times he had chosen boardrooms over bedtime stories, meetings over meals, but he clung to the hope that fate would give him a chance to make it right. The hallway buzzed with hurried footsteps, the sharp scent of disinfectant filled the air, and every passing second clawed at him, each tick of the clock echoing like a hammer in his chest. He sat there, motionless, gripping the edge of his chair as though it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. Behind the swinging doors, muffled voices of doctors rose and fell, machines beeped faintly, and the uncertainty gnawed at him with every breath. The girl finally moved, walking closer, her small hand tugging gently at his sleeve. Richard looked down at her, his eyes blurred, and she whispered softly, "He's strong. He'll fight." Her words, though simple, sank deep into his heart, giving him a sliver of strength in the storm of his fear. He nodded, unable to speak, and let his gaze return to the doors, where his entire world lay in the hands of strangers, working tirelessly to save his boy. The minutes stretched into hours, each one an unbearable weight pressing down on Richard as he sat hunched forward in the hard plastic chair, his eyes fixed on the motionless doors that separated him from his son. His body was exhausted, but his spirit refused to yield, clinging desperately to hope with every breath. The sterile smell of antiseptic clung to the air, the distant hum of machines whispered faintly from behind the walls, and every sound only deepened the ache in his chest. At last, the door creaked open and a doctor emerged, his face unreadable at first, then softening as he gave Richard a quiet nod. Relief rushed through him like a tidal wave, weakening his knees as he pushed himself up and stumbled toward the room where Daniel had been taken. His hand trembled on the cold metal handle before he finally found the strength to push it open, his heart hammering louder than the beeping monitor inside. There, lying pale but breathing on the hospital bed, was Daniel, his chest rising faintly beneath the thin blanket, his face calm in slumber. Richard's breath hitched as he stepped closer, inch by inch, afraid that even the sound of his footsteps might disturb the fragile miracle before him. He pulled a chair closer, sat down, and reached for his son's hand, his large fingers curling gently around the smaller, cooler ones, gripping them as though letting go would mean losing him again. His lips moved without sound, prayers still forming, apologies still rising, promises still clinging to his tongue. Then, with a small twitch of his eyelids, Daniel stirred. Richard froze, his entire world narrowing to the slight flutter of his son's lashes. Slowly, carefully, Daniel's eyes blinked open, hazy and unfocused at first, before finally finding his father's tear-streaked face. A faint smile curved across his lips, weak but enough to shatter Richard's composure, and his small voice cracked the silence. "Dad, you came?" The words broke Richard apart. His throat closed, his eyes overflowed, and he leaned forward, gathering Daniel carefully into his arms, clutching him with a desperation born from too many years of distance. "I'll always come, son," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling against Daniel's ear. Forgive me for not being there before." His tears fell freely, dampening his son's hair, each drop carrying the weight of regret and the promise of change. Daniel's arms, though weak, lifted slowly to wrap around his father's shoulders, his grip frail but Ed with more strength than Richard had ever known. For a long moment, father and son simply clung to each other, time dissolving in the warmth of reunion, the beeping monitor, the only witness to a bond mended by near loss. At the doorway, the little girl stood quietly, her small frame leaning against the wall, her wide eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She had prayed with all her might, and now, seeing the two together, the heavy knot in her chest loosened, replaced by a fragile smile. She didn't need words. She didn't need thanks. It was enough for her to see a father and son rediscover one another, to know that her small act of courage had opened the door for love to take its place again. Her lips trembled as she smiled through the tears, her hands clasped together as though to hold on to the moment, and she whispered softly to herself, "Thank you." Richard caught sight of her standing there, and for a second his heart swelled even more, but his eyes returned to Daniel, unwilling to miss a single second of his boy's fragile awakening. He brushed Daniel's hair back gently, whispering once more, "I'm here now, and I will never leave again." sealing the vow with the strength of a father who finally understood what mattered most. Richard held Daniel's hand a little longer, savoring the rhythm of his son's breathing, before his eyes shifted back toward the small figure lingering at the doorway. The little girl hadn't moved much, as though she feared stepping too far into a space that didn't belong to her. Yet her presence filled the room with a quiet strength. Richard rose slowly, brushed the tears from his face, and crossed to her. She looked up at him nervously, her hands clutching the hem of her worn dress, her lips pressed tight as though she expected to be sent away now that her role was done. But instead of turning her out, Richard knelt to her level, his eyes softening with a gratitude words could never capture. "You saved my boy," he whispered, his voice breaking again. "And in saving him, you saved me too." The girl blinked quickly, startled by his gentleness, and gave a shy nod. "My name's Emily," she said softly, her voice fragile but steady, as if sharing it was a gift she hadn't offered in a long while. The name lingered in Richard's mind like a melody, simple yet profound. "Emily," he repeated, as though promising to remember it forever. When he stood again, he reached out and took her small hand into his own, guiding her closer to Daniel's bedside. Daniel turned his head, his tired eyes brightening when he saw her. "You were with me?" he asked faintly, and Emily nodded, her lips curving into a shy smile. I couldn't leave you there," she murmured. Daniel's weak fingers reached out, and she touched them lightly, two children bound by a moment of fate neither could have imagined. Richard watched the exchange, and a warmth bloomed in his chest that was different from anything he had known in boardrooms or business halls. He realized then that Emily wasn't just a passerby, wasn't just a fleeting figure in the story of his son's survival. She was the reason this reunion existed at all. Days later, when Daniel's strength had begun to return, and doctors assured them of his recovery, Richard made a decision that left no room for hesitation. He took Emily's hand once more, this time not with the gratitude of a desperate father, but with the certainty of a man who had found something greater than fortune. "From today," he said, his voice firm yet tender, "you're part of this family." Emily froze, her eyes widening, her lips parting in disbelief. "But I don't have a family," she whispered, as though saying it aloud made the emptiness heavier. Richard's gaze softened even more, and he bent down to wrap her small frame in his arms. "You do now," he replied, pulling her close against the steady beat of his heart. For a moment she stood stiff, unaccustomed, to such warmth. Then slowly her arms crept around his neck, holding on as though she was afraid the moment might vanish. Daniel smiled from his bed, his face glowing brighter than it had in weeks. He reached out toward them, and Richard guided Emily closer so that his son could clasp her hand too. In that quiet hospital room, something larger than blood bound them together, a promise, a choice, a second chance at belonging. When they finally returned home, the mansion that had once been vast and hollow seemed to breathe again. No longer just echoing with the click of polished shoes or the silence of solitude, it now filled with laughter as Daniel's voice rang down the hallways, chasing shadows from corners where loneliness used to live. Emily's footsteps padded softly behind him, her giggles blending with his, weaving joy into the very walls. Richard stood often at the threshold of rooms, watching them run together, play together, live together, and every time he felt his chest tighten with a gratitude that humbled even a man of his wealth. He no longer measured success in profits or properties. He measured it in the sound of Daniel's laughter, in the way Emily's smile brightened even the darkest mornings, in the way the house finally felt like a home. Emily's past as an orphan, selling flowers on cold streets, faded slowly into a memory, replaced by warm meals, a bed of her own, and a family that held her close. Richard often found her arranging wildflowers in little jars around the mansion, a habit she never lost, and each time he saw them, he thought of how a single brave child had given him back his son and, unknowingly, had given him a daughter too. As seasons passed, The bond only grew deeper, not bound by blood, but by love, by courage, and by the simple truth that sometimes families are chosen, not born. And so the mansion that once echoed with emptiness became a haven of second chances, where a father, a son, and a little girl named Emily learned that love, once found, changes everything forever.